Prove your power. Marry Valeria. 6 moons. That's enough time to make any woman fall in love with me. Valeria raised her gaze calmly and smiled a smile that promised everything except ease. The bet was made, but Alejandro had no idea what he was getting himself into. It was a warm night in M'bale, the village where even the wind seemed too lazy to blow after sunset. The sky was filled with stars, the drums echoed in the distance, and the scent of roasted cassava and game meat floated through the air like an ancestral blessing. Around the great bonfire in the village square, men and women danced, laughed, and told stories as they had for generations. In the middle of the circle, with a cup of palm wine in his hand and his chest puffed out like a man who wore his own name as a crown, stood Alejandro M'bale, wealthiest man in the village. He owned cacao and cotton plantations, livestock, and even the only corn mill in the region, which he claimed was worth more than gold. Alejandro was the kind of man who walked as if the ground asked permission for him to pass. He wore an expensive, vibrantly colored cloth tailored by seamstresses from the capital, along with leather sandals so polished they blinded the unwary. As usual, 3 slender-waisted, long-necked women surrounded him, competing to see who could laugh the loudest at his unfinished jokes. Then, emerging from the shadows like a man with a plan up his sleeve, appeared Santiago, Kibora Alejandro's childhood friend and current rival in matters of ego. Ah, Alejandro, always surrounded by flowers without roots, Santiago said, stepping into the circle with a mischievous smile. Alejandro raised an eyebrow, already familiar with that tone of voice. What now, Santiago? Are you going to challenge me to buy the sky? Santiago laughed, took a gourd of drink, and sat beside him. Actually, I have something more difficult for you. You boast so much, you talk endlessly about power and conquest. But tell me, have you ever conquered a woman who did not wish to be conquered? Alejandro burst into laughter. Come on, Santiago, they all want it. Some just take longer to admit it. The bonfire seemed to burn hotter, as Santiago smirked and said, Bet 100 cows, 50 oil barrels, one who washes clothes in the river and has no time for nonsense. Even more, that you can't stay with her for 6 moons. The crowd around them laughed and murmured. The women surrounding Alejandro stared at him with wide eyes. He nearly choked on his wine. Have you lost your mind, Santiago? You want me to marry whom? One of your mustached aunts? Santiago simply nodded toward the other side of the bonfire, where a robust woman with gleaming skin under the firelight sat laughing loudly with a group of washerwomen. She wore a golden yellow kaitenge, elegantly tied, and in her eyes was a defiant sparklione that would not tolerate insults. Valeria N'Dala, the washerwoman. A fisherman's daughter, she has never worn makeup, never bowed to a man, and has rejected all the suitors in the village, including the chief guard's son. Alejandro frowned, then crossed his arms. She doesn't even look impressionable. Exactly, that's why she's perfect. So, do you accept? Santiago challenged, the malice of someone who knew he had touched his friend's pride gleaming in his eyes. Alejandro looked at the sky, then at the bonfire, and finally at Valeria. 6 moons, that's enough time to make any woman fall in love with me. Then it's a dealer challenge. And when it's over, not only will you give me the cows, but you will also call me the master of conquest. They shook hands as the crowd erupted in cheers, already speculating whether Alejandro would emerge victorious or with his ego trampled in the mud. But only one person in that village knew what was coming, and it wasn't Alejandro. The morning after the challenge around the bonfire, Valeria was where she always was by the river, washing clothes with strong arms and determination in her eyes. She wore her blue kaitenge, wet up to her knees, her hands reddened from scrubbing. Then she heard the sound of elegant footsteps on the stones. It was Alejandro's embroidered sandals that had likely never touched mud in his life. Valeria N'Dala, he said with a rehearsed smile and a cotton cloth draped over his shoulders, as if he had just stepped out of a portrait session. She didn't even pause in beating the clothes against the washboard. Who wants to know? Alejandro M'bale. The pleasure is mine. Valeria let out a short laugh and looked at him for the first time. Ah, the famous Prince of Cotton. What are you doing here among soap and foam? Did you lose your estate? I came to extend an invitation, he replied, adjusting the cloth on his shoulders. A simple dinner tonight, grilled fish, yams, and maybe a good conversation under the moonlight. She put the soap down and stood up, wiping her hands on the cloth tied around her waist. Her purple kaitenge fluttered in the wind, and though her sandals were worn, she stood with the posture of a queen. "You are Alejandro M'bale?" she asked, arching her eyebrows and gazing at him with eyes as sharp as a cassava cutting knife. "In the flesh, and it is a pleasure to meet the most talked about woman in the village." Valeria crossed her arms. "And why would a man like you, always surrounded by women dancing with their navels exposed, invite me to eat fish?" "Because I like challenges." She let out a dry laugh. "Then know that I'm a challenge that cannot be bought with corn or gold." Alejandro swallowed hard. He was used to women who smiled at the first compliment, not to one who scrubbed clothes as if preparing for battle. Yet that night, Valeria appeared at the agreed-upon placia, small, secluded spot. In the village center, with a straw mat spread out under the moonlight, a bonfire burning, and 2 steaming plates of fish with ginger and yam, Valeria was beautiful. Her vibrant purple kaitenge, elegantly fitted to her body, contrasted with the simplicity of her sandals. But it was her way of walking unhurried, fearless, that caught everyone's attention. Alejandro stood to greet her, trying to hide his nerves. "Thank you for coming." "Don't thank me yet," she replied. "Let's see if the fish is worth it." During dinner, the conversation was like a tamborembe, full of rhythm, pauses, and strong beats. Alejandro tried to seduce her. Valeria responded with irony. He threw compliments her way. She told stories about how she had escaped from bold suitors. Then, with a sip of hibiscus juice and a sigh of surrender, Alejandro got straight to the point. "I have a proposal, an agreement. If you agree to pretend to be my wife for 6 moons, in exchange, you'll get part of the profits this contract will bring me. Let's say 30%. Valeria looked at him as if he were reading the book upside down. 30%? Do you want to buy my dignity for the price of a banana? Do better. 40%, Alejandro replied, swallowing hard. She crossed her arms, thought for a few seconds, and said, "I accept. But if you think you're going to tell me to shut up, have me wear flowery fabrics, and smile at your guests, you're very mistaken." Alejandro smiled, this time with respect, not mockery. "Deal." And there, under the moonlight, in the village of M'bale, the strangest contract in history was sealed. Not with a kiss or a handshake, but with a firm look from someone who knew exactly what they were getting into. Valeria wasn't for sale, but she knew how to play the game, and Alejandro was about to learn that a real challenge begins where the ego ends. The wedding was held on a cloudy morning under the sacred baobab tree of M'bale, where the ancestors blessed the most important bonds. There were no drums, no dances, only the presence of the elders, who sang brief chants and cast sideways glances at the unlikely couple. Valeria N'Dala looked impeccable in a moss-green kaitenge with golden details. She kept her chin high the entire time, as if she knew that this wedding was more of a contract than a union. Alejandro, in his embroidered white tunic, looked around, trying to decipher what he felt: pride, curiosity, or pure fear of the woman who was now his wife. On the surface, before anyone could say that love was in the air, Valeria made it clear, "This is just an agreement. Don't ask me for love, don't ask me for silence. I have my life." And with that blessing, blessed by truth, the ceremony ended. No rice, no party, just curious glances and muffled whispers. The coexistence was quiet and sometimes cold. Valeria continued with her routine. She woke up early, washed clothes in the river with other women, carried basins on her head as if they were feathers, cooked outdoors with the neighbors, and told jokes that made the chickens cluck. Meanwhile, Alejandro, used to being the center of attention, felt lost. He tried to please her with silk fabrics brought from the capital, ivory necklaces, expensive perfumes, and even a woven chair with a high back that looked like a queen's throne. Valeria rolled her eyes. "I thought you wanted a real woman, not a decorative statue," she said while greasing the bottom of the pot with palm oil. The more luxury he offered, the more she pulled away. He didn't understand. For Alejandro, everything could always be solved with money. But under the same roof, he realized that Valeria wasn't enchanted by shiny promises. She was made of clay, sun, and struggle, and he had never learned how to negotiate that. Alejandro's patience began to wear thin. The silence of coexistence was already difficult. But the worst part was seeing that Valeria didn't bend. Nothing in her changed. She didn't become more docile, more reserved, more suited to the role of the rich wife he had expected. That's when he tried to take control. First, he asked her to stop going to the river. Then, he ordered the cancellation of her laundry contracts, saying that now she was a married woman who didn't need to work like a peasant. Valeria listened in silence. The next day, she was at the river again, hitting sheets against the stone as if she were beating the arrogance out of him. Then Alejandro went further. He used his contacts to make her orders more difficult, pressured merchants to stop hiring her, and tried to prevent her from leaving the house. "You're my wife," he shouted one day. "You must live by my side, under my roof, by my rules." Valeria lifted her eyes from the beans she was stirring and replied without raising her voice. "I'm a real woman, Alejandro. I'm not a rag to hang on your trophy wall." That hit Alejandro harder than any punch. In the village, the whispers grew. Neighbors noticed the discomfort, the cold looks, the distance, and the elders who had once watched with skepticism now shook their heads in silence, as if they knew that this marriage was more of a battlefield than a home. Alejandro wanted control, Valeria wanted freedom, and within the walls of that house, a silent war was born, where love had never even been invited to enter.
The full moon illuminated the village of Malabar with a silver glow that made the straw roofs look covered in stars. It was a quiet night, with a calm breeze and low fire in the central courtyard. Alejandro was sitting in front of the terrace with a glass of hibiscus wine in his hands, while Valeria cut cassava roots with surgical precision, as if each slice eased an old pain. He couldn't take it anymore. He stood up suddenly, his chest tight, and rasped out, "Why did you agree to marry me? What's your secret? And why, Valeria? Why can't I conquer you like I conquered all the others?" Valeria stopped. The knife was stuck in the cassava. Her gaze, always firm, now seemed to carry more weight than the world. She sat on a wooden bench and looked at Alejandro with a silence that cut deeper than words. "Do you want to know why? Fine, I'll tell you." The wind picked up, as if time itself were paying attention. "My father was a potter, a simple man. He made pots, casseroles, bowl saw with his hands. He had a small workshop near the river, where the clay was good. He was the pride of our family. He said each piece had a soul." Alejandro was beginning to understand where this was going, but Valeria continued. "And each word came like an arrow, until the day you decided to expand your business. You bought that land. My father begged you. He went to your house with cracked feet and hands covered in clay, asking you not to evict him." Alejandro lowered his head. "But you only thought about the profits. You ordered everything demolished. You didn't notify anyone. You didn't wait. One day, my father had a workshop. The next, nothing but ruins." Valeria took a deep breath, her voice shaking. "He got sick. His body weakened, his heart even more. He died in a few months. My mother died of sadness. And I lost a child. I was pregnant. The stress, the pain, everything was too much. You took everything from me," said Valeria with a hard but not cruel gaze. "And when you invited me to marry you, I accepted not out of interest, not out of defiance, but to look you in the eyes every day and see if you were man enough to face the pain you caused." Silence. A silence so dense that not even the crickets dared to sing. Alejandro fell to his knees not out of dramatism, but because of weight. The weight on his shoulders, his soul, his heart. As if at that moment, the red earth of the village was calling him back to the humility he had forgotten. He cried. He did not speak. For the first time in a long time, he had no answers-only memories. The contract signed without reading it. The eviction executed without a second thought. The gold earned without remorse. Valeria did not smile, nor did she revel in his suffering. She simply stood up and turned her back, not out of anger, but because sometimes regret needs time to mature in silence. "I don't want your apologies now," she said before disappearing into the night. "I want to see what you do with what I've just told you." In the days that followed, something strange happened. Alejandro disappeared. From the parties, from the business meetings in the capital, from the fancy lunches with men in gleaming suits. Instead, he began to appear in the local market. First, helping an old man set up his stall to sell cassava. Then, sitting on the ground with artisans, listening to their stories, learning about fair prices. He went to the cotton fields. His once pristine white clothes were now covered in dust. His hands, once as smooth as porcelain, now bore calluses. Over time, he created a community fund using part of the fortune he had accumulated. Money that once fed mansions now built small houses, renovated mud brick schools, and supported potters, seamstresses, and local farmers. Alejandro returned land that had been taken in the past. He signed direct purchase contracts with the village women, paying them triple the usual price. All without boasting, without speeches. Valeria watched. She said nothing, but something in her gaze began to change. It was not forgiveness at least not yet, but doubt. The doubt that perhaps this man was not just regretful, but truly changing. Time in M'bale seemed to move more slowly after the rainy season. The dust once again rose on the roads. The scent of roasted corn filled the market. The drums remained silent, waiting for the next celebration. And with the passing of another moon, the contract came to an end. Weeks had passed since the bet marriage. Alejandro, dressed in neatly pressed clothes and wearing a contained smile, met Santiago Kibora under the sacred tree. Santiago was laughing, holding a rope tied to a robust ox. "Here are your 100 cows and 50 barrels of palm oil." "You won," Santiago said, patting him on the shoulder. "But tell me, what did you win?" Alejandro held the rope but did not smile. His gaze was distant, far from the tree, far from the prize. Valeria was not there. That morning, she had simply gathered her belongings, rolled her fabrics into a basket, balanced the bundle on her head with the same dignity as always, and left. No fights, no drama. "The contract is over. Now I return to my life," she had said as she closed the door to the house. Standing in the doorway, Alejandro had tried to offer her part of what he had received done of the cows, a piece of land, gold, perfumes. But Valeria rejected everything. "I don't want payment. I wasn't your wife," I was a reminder, "and I fulfilled my role." And so, she left. And with her, something inside Alejandro left too. The following days felt unbearably long. The village festivities no longer had meaning. The music sounded hollow. The women danced with decorative smiles. And he who had once been the center of everything now longed only for silence. Sitting by the riverbank, Alejandro watched the small fishing boats cross the water, but his mind was elsewhere, remembering Valeria's firm voice, the way she sliced cassava without hesitation, the way she faced anyone with eyes full of truth. That night, he did something unthinkable. He went after her. She was at the market, cleaning fish with the other women, her face serene. When she saw him, she showed no surprise. She simply continued working. Alejandro, with humility in his eyes and dust covering his feet, approached and said, "I'm not here to ask for anything else. I just want to be your friend if you'll allow me." Valeria glanced at him out of the corner of her eye, wiped her hands on her apron, and answered simply, "You're changing." He nodded. "I'm not doing it for you. I'm doing it because I need to stop being the man who destroyed your world." Valeria did not respond with words. Instead, she took a clay gourd, dipped it into a pot of fresh tamarind water, and offered it to him. A small gesture, but in the village of M'bale, offering tamarind water to someone was a sign of peace, of a new beginning. Alejandro drank. In silence, days turned into weeks, and the two began to spend more time together as friends. They walked along the paths, gathered wild tea leaves, shared stories. Alejandro now listened more than he spoke, and Valeria, little by little, laughed more than she avoided, until one night, beneath a clear sky where the stars seemed closer to the earth, they walked side by side through a freshly harvested peanut field. The breeze was soft. Their conversation had ended, but the silence between them was comfortable. Without a word, they stopped walking. Their eyes met. She, in her simple fabrics, her head held high as always. He, now without expensive perfumes, but with a clean heart. One step, two, and there, under the African sky, where time feels more real, they kissed for the first time. It was not just a kiss. It was not a kiss of conquest or impulse. It was a kiss of recognition of souls that had faced each other, tested each other, transformed, and finally found one another. After that kiss under the stars, everything changed. But not in the rushed way many would expect. Valeria and Alejandro did not run to make eternal promises the next day. Instead, they began to walk more slowly, hand in hand, with open hearts and past wounds exposed, without hiding. Valeria, who once carried deep scars like heavy baskets of cassava on her head, now felt light. It was not just about the man standing before her, but about what he had become. The Alejandro of the past was vain, arrogant, a slave to his own power. But now, he was a real man not because of his strength or wealth, but because he had learned to serve, to love, and to care. You didn't win me over with gifts, Alejandro. You won me over with change. And when he proposed this time truly, without contracts, without bets, without barrels of palm oil, she did not hesitate. She had only one request. No luxuries. I want to marry the man, not the image. The wedding took place under the sacred tree of the village of Malaba, where ancestral spirits are honored. But this time, there was a celebration. The drums played from early morning. Women braided their hair with flowers, and the village children ran with wooden spears, imitating warriors. It was as if the whole village was saying, "This love is ours too." Valeria wore a white kitenge with golden embroidery, fabric borrowed from her aunt, who only wore it on special days. Alejandro wore a simple, deep blue cotton shirt and walked barefoot. He said he wanted to feel the village soil under his feet as a symbol of the humility he had learned. They exchanged vows with the birds singing and the aroma of goat stew filling the air. When they kissed, it was as if the entire village held its breath. Their honeymoon was simple but unforgettable. They traveled to a nearby village, where they slept in a mud hut with a thatched roof and windows without glass. They ate roasted corn by the fire, swam in the river, and talked about the future. "I never imagined falling in love with a woman like you," Alejandro admitted one night, watching her wrapped in fabrics, laughing with her mouth full of sweet breadfruit. Valeria raised an eyebrow, half serious, half joking. "Like me? How? Outside of everything I thought I wanted, but exactly everything I needed." And there was the truth. Alejandro didn't just love Valeria, he admired her for her strength, her wisdom, her determination. He realized that true beauty is not found in a mirror, but in the way one lives, respects, and lifts others with words and actions. A few months later, Valeria felt morning sickness. She thought it was something she had eaten at the market, but after 3 more days, she visited the village healer. The woman examined her with hands and eyes trained by nature. "You have 2 hearts inside you, my child. Twins." The news spread like wildfire. Even the village rooster seemed to crow louder that morning. Alejandro cried. He planted 2 baobab saplings in front of their home, saying that, like his children, they would take years to grow, but would live for generations. Valeria, now with a new glow in her eyes, laughed differently. It was no longer a laugh of defense or sarcasm, but a light-hearted laugh of someone who no longer needed to protect herself. Alejandro was no longer the conqueror of smiles. He was the man who woke up early to fetch water from the well, who learned to grind maize, who carried baskets of cassava for the neighbors, who helped teach the village children about responsibility. And when the village called him a respected man, he always said, "Respect only came when I stopped seeking admiration and started truly loving." At the end of this story, on a night when the stars shone brightly, Valeria looked at Alejandro, her belly now round, as she sat on a straw mat and said, "You didn't change for me. You changed for yourself, and that is what made me love you." Alejandro only smiled, his eyes filled with tears, and when the young men of the village seek his advice, he tells them firmly, never let money take away what truly matters. He learned, in the hardest, yet most beautiful way, that no amount of gold can buy the respect of a wise woman. No grand feast is worth more than a simple meal shared with a wife. No power is greater than the power to care with love. If this story inspired you, leave a like, comment, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who needs to hear this. God bless you, and see you next time.